Ethan Brooks never imagined that his move to a quiet suburban neighborhood would lead to such an unexpected and troublesome ordeal. At 38, after years of living in cramped city apartments, he had finally purchased his dream home, a modest, three-bedroom house nestled in a serene, well-kept community. It seemed like the perfect place to settle down, enjoy peace, and create a life that was far from the chaos he had known. After years of hard work, Ethan was eager to embrace this new chapter. However, he had no idea that this peaceful neighborhood would soon become a battleground, not just for his privacy, but for his sanity. With Karen Miller, a domineering HOA member, at the heart of it all. The Homeowners Association, HOA, in the area was notorious for its strict rules. From controlling the height of grass in yards to dictating the color of fences, the HOA had regulations for nearly every detail of life in the neighborhood. Ethan had heard rumors about its overreach before moving in, but he hadn't truly grasped the extent of their power until he met Karen. Karen Miller, 52, had been on the HOA board for as long as anyone could remember. Known for being an insufferable busybody, she had a penchant for inserting herself into other people's affairs, often without invitation. Ethan first noticed her presence when the contractors building his backyard pool warned him about her frequent visits. What started as innocent curiosity soon turned into an invasive surveillance of his life. Karen, it seemed, had taken it upon herself to monitor Ethan's every move. At first, Ethan brushed it off as a small inconvenience. After all, it was a minor price to pay for the home he'd always wanted. But as time went on, he began to feel the full weight of Karen's constant presence. The contractors shared that she was there daily, asking about the pool installation and offering unsolicited advice. It wasn't just the pool she was concerned with. She knew Ethan's work schedule, when he was home, when he and his wife, Vanessa, would be away. It seemed that nothing in his life was private anymore. It wasn't long before Karen's behavior crossed the line. One evening, when Vanessa was away, Karen showed up with a casserole. A gesture that, on the surface, seemed kind, but was actually an excuse to check on Ethan, to take care of him while his wife was away. This crossed a boundary Ethan hadn't realized was there, and it left him unsettled. Ethan attempted to laugh it off, thinking it was just part of life in a new neighborhood. However, over time, he couldn't ignore the growing feeling of being watched. Karen wasn't just a nosy neighbor anymore. She was a constant, looming presence in his life. Even his backyard, which should have been his sanctuary, wasn't free from her watchful eye. Every time he stepped outside, he could almost feel her gaze from across the street. The only person who seemed to understand his growing frustration was his elderly neighbor, Evelyn Graves. At 76, Evelyn had lived in the neighborhood for decades and was no stranger to sleepless nights. Ethan had grown fond of their late-night chats, where Evelyn offered a calming presence and insightful observations. Unlike Karen, Evelyn's presence was comforting, not invasive. As Ethan and Vanessa prepared for a long-awaited vacation, Ethan's growing paranoia reached a tipping point. His frustrations with the HOA and Karen's surveillance had built up over weeks. That night, unable to sleep, he made a small but significant decision. He moved the location of his emergency house keys. It may have seemed like a trivial act, but in that moment, it felt like the only thing he could control in an otherwise uncontrollable situation. The next day, as they packed for their trip, Vanessa looked at him curiously when he mentioned moving the keys, but she dismissed it. They left that afternoon, looking forward to a much-needed break. But the calm they sought was about to be shattered in the most unexpected way. That evening, after a day of sightseeing, they returned to their hotel room, exhausted. Ethan was ready to fall asleep when his phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. Groggily, he answered. "Hello? Ethan, it's Karen," came her voice, sharp and insistent. "I need to know where your emergency house keys are." His heart sank as he tried to shake the fog from his mind. "Karen, how did you get my number?" "I looked it up in the HOA records," she replied nonchalantly. "I need them now. This is an emergency." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Emergency? It's 2 a.m. What could possibly be so urgent?" Karen's tone shifted, laced with irritation. It's not important. Just give me the keys now, and I'll explain later. Ethan's anxiety spiked. What emergency requires you to have my keys at this hour? There was a brief silence before Karen's voice grew colder. If you don't give me the keys, I'll just break in. I have plenty of support on the HOA board, and you'll regret not helping me. Ethan's stomach churned. Was she threatening him? Are you threatening me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Karen's voice became even more dismissive. You're being stingy. I'll get those keys one way or another. And with that, the line went dead. Ethan sat there, stunned, his mind racing. What had just happened? He couldn't believe what he had just heard. His privacy had been violated, and now Karen was willing to escalate things to an extreme level. Trying to collect himself, Ethan attempted to go back to sleep, but his mind kept racing. Just as he began to relax, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was Evelyn. Ethan, I saw her, Evelyn said, her voice crackling over the line. She's in your backyard. And she wasn't alone. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He sat up in bed, his pulse spiking. What do you mean? Who was with her? A man, Evelyn replied, her voice tinged with urgency. They were at your shed trying to break into it. I've got it all on tape. Ethan felt a cold chill run through him. This was no longer a simple neighborhood nuisance. This was a violation of his personal space, his sanctuary. I'll handle this, Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with determination. I'm calling the police. It was time to take action. This wasn't just a petty annoyance anymore. Karen had crossed a line, and he was done being passive. He was going to fight back. As he prepared to call the authorities, he knew one thing for certain. This battle was far from over, and Karen was about to learn that Ethan Brooks would not be pushed around. Ethan's heart raced as he hung up the phone with Evelyn, the weight of her words sinking in. Karen wasn't just a nuisance anymore. She was an active threat. Ethan's blood ran cold as he realized that she had crossed a line, far beyond any boundary of decency. She had invaded his property, and now she was working with someone else to breach the sanctity of his home. There was no turning back now. It wasn't just about defending his house anymore. It was about reclaiming his life from someone who believed she had the right to control every aspect of it. After hanging up with Evelyn, Ethan dialed the police, his hands shaking as he explained the situation. He had spent his life working hard for the home he now cherished, and no one, especially not Karen, was going to take that from him. As the police assured him that they were on their way, Ethan's thoughts swirled. He couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that had crept in, gnawing at the edges of his mind. This wasn't just about a minor dispute anymore. Karen's actions had escalated to something darker, and Ethan was ready to stand up to it, no matter the cost. The police arrived at his house with flashing lights and an air of professionalism that reassured Ethan, though only slightly. Officer Blake Harrison, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached Ethan. Mr. Brooks, he began, his voice steady, we've reviewed the footage. It's clear that someone was tampering with your property, specifically the lockbox by your jacuzzi. We're investigating further, but it's obvious now that Karen and her accomplice are not just making trouble. They're trying to destroy what you've worked for. Ethan felt a rush of emotions, anger, frustration, relief, and even a sense of vindication. Finally, someone was taking him seriously. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew he wasn't going to back down. He was going to fight for his home. The officers took statements, examined the area around the pool and shed, and began looking for any further evidence that could link Karen to this break-in attempt. Ethan stood nearby, feeling a mixture of dread and determination. The quiet neighborhood he had dreamed of now felt like a battleground, and Karen had made it personal. As the investigation continued, Ethan's anxiety mounted. He spent the next few days pacing his home, not able to shake the feeling that Karen was still out there, plotting her next move. He tried to focus on the paperwork the police had left behind, but his mind kept returning to the unsettling image of Karen and her accomplice standing in his backyard, trying to break into his property. Why was she doing this? What was it about him, about his home, that made her go so far? The next day, when he received another call from Evelyn, he wasn't surprised to hear the urgency in her voice. "Ethan, they're back. Karen and that man. This time, they're messing with the power lines by your pool. I don't know what they're doing, but it doesn't look good. They're clearly trying to sabotage something." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. The feeling of dread hit him again, more intensely than before. This wasn't just about breaking into his shed or spying on him anymore. Now they were attempting to disable the very thing he had built with such pride. His pool, his private sanctuary, was under attack. "I'm coming home right now," Ethan said, his voice tight with urgency. There was no time to waste. Karen wasn't going to get away with this. Not now, not after everything he had fought for. The drive home was a blur of panic and anger. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing with thoughts of how far Karen was willing to go. What else was she planning? The city lights flickered outside the car window, but Ethan couldn't focus on anything but the mounting fear that something was going to happen to his home, something he wouldn't be able to undo. When he finally arrived, the police were already there, and the sight of their flashing lights brought a wave of relief. But as he approached, Officer Harrison stepped toward him, his expression grave. "We found the tampering you mentioned, Mr. Brooks," Officer Harrison said. "It looks like they were trying to disable the power to your pool. There's no doubt now, they were trying to cause significant damage to your property. We've got enough evidence to make arrests, but we need to know if you want to press charges." Ethan's mind reeled as he processed the officer's words. It was no longer a simple dispute over property lines or pool installations. This was an all-out attack on his life, his home, and everything he had worked so hard to build. He felt the fury rise in his chest as he nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice firm. "I want to press charges. I'm not going to let her destroy everything I've fought for." The decision to take legal action felt like a small victory, but the relief was short-lived. As the investigation continued, Ethan realized that Karen's attempts to control him weren't just a personal vendetta. She was part of a system that had manipulated and intimidated the people around her for years. The HOA was her tool, and now that Ethan had become her target, she wasn't going to let him win without a fight. Days passed, and the sense of unease didn't go away. Karen had not been arrested yet, but her influence in the neighborhood was still palpable. Ethan could feel her presence every time he stepped outside, every time he saw one of her supporters lurking in the shadows. She had a way of making people afraid, making them doubt themselves. But Ethan had learned that fear wasn't going to control him anymore. As the weeks wore on, Ethan found a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the people in his neighborhood who had been too afraid to stand up to Karen. They were all looking to him for guidance, for the courage to fight back, and he wasn't going to let them down. Then came the moment he had been waiting for. The police finally made an arrest, and Karen was charged with trespassing, property damage, and harassment. Ethan couldn't help but feel a wave of satisfaction wash over him as he read the news. The nightmare was finally over. Karen's reign of terror was coming to an end. But as much as he wanted to savor the victory, Ethan knew that the battle wasn't truly over. There would be more legal hurdles to overcome, more battles to fight. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was finally in control of his life again. He had fought back against the darkness that Karen had tried to impose, and he had won. With the support of his neighbors, the police, and his own determination, Ethan knew he was no longer alone in this fight. The community that had once seemed divided was now united against the forces of control and manipulation. And Ethan, the quiet man who had just wanted a peaceful life, had become the symbol of resistance. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Ethan Brooks wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. He had found his voice, and he was going to use it to make sure that his home, his sanctuary, and his peace of mind would never again be threatened. And, with every challenge that lay ahead, he would face it head-on, with the strength of his community beside him. This time the gloves were off, and Karen had underestimated him. As the days passed, Ethan found himself reflecting on the strange, unsettling journey that had led him to this point. He had always prided himself on living a quiet, peaceful life. But Karen Miller had shattered that peace in ways he never imagined. Now, as the legal battles continued, Ethan's determination had solidified. He wasn't just fighting for his house. He was fighting for his right to exist in peace without fear of intrusion, without the looming threat of a neighbor who seemed to think she could control every aspect of his life. The arrest of Karen Miller had certainly been a step in the right direction, but Ethan knew that the path ahead was far from clear. As the legal process moved forward, Karen was still using her influence over the HOA, trying to make life difficult for him at every turn. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, Ethan felt like he had the upper hand. The oppressive weight that had been hanging over him for months was finally starting to lift, even if just slightly. One evening, as Ethan was sitting at his kitchen table, reviewing the stack of paperwork from his lawyer, the phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but Ethan had learned to trust his instincts by now. He answered the call with a sense of apprehension that had become all too familiar in recent weeks. "Ethan," a voice said on the other end of the line. It was Evelyn, his elderly neighbor. "You're going to want to hear this." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Evelyn had always been a reliable source of information. When it came to Karen and the rest of the neighborhood's affairs, he set the papers down and leaned forward, trying to steady his breath. "What is it, Evelyn?" "They've done it again." Evelyn's voice was strained with concern. "Karen's back in the game. She's rallying the neighbors, trying to turn them against you again." Ethan felt a flash of anger surge within him. "What do you mean? I thought she was done with all this?" Evelyn sighed, a sound full of frustration. "She's not done. She's just being more subtle now. She's whispering to people, convincing them that you're the one causing all the trouble. You've got to be careful, Ethan. She's trying to manipulate the HOA again, and this time she's using the community to do it." Ethan's stomach dropped. He had hoped that Karen's influence would wane after her arrest, but it seemed he was wrong. The fight was far from over, and it wasn't just about legal paperwork anymore. It was about his standing in the community, about the people around him who had been swayed by Karen's lies and manipulation. "I can't believe this," Ethan muttered, frustration clouding his thoughts. "What's she saying now?" "She's telling people that you're the one making waves, that you're the one who's bringing bad energy into the neighborhood," Evelyn explained, her voice laced with disbelief. "She's even suggested that you're trying to turn the HOA against everyone else, that you're some kind of troublemaker. She's playing the victim, and she's good at it." Ethan clenched his fists. He had known Karen was capable of manipulation, but this was a new low. She wasn't just targeting him anymore. She was trying to paint him as the villain, trying to destroy his reputation and make everyone else believe her lies. "I won't let her do this," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I'm not backing down now." Evelyn's voice softened, as if she understood the weight of what Ethan was going through. "I know, dear, but you need to be careful. You've got more allies than you think, but you've also got people who might turn their backs on you if they believe her lies. You've got to stay strong." Ethan didn't respond right away. He was too busy thinking, too busy plotting his next move. He couldn't afford to let Karen continue to control the narrative. This had gone beyond just defending his property. Now, it was about fighting for the truth. The next morning, Ethan decided to take matters into his own hands. He wasn't going to let Karen manipulate the community anymore. He called a meeting with his neighbors, inviting them to his house for an open discussion about everything that had been happening. He wasn't going to hide anymore. If Karen was going to use lies to turn people against him, then he would counter with the truth. It was time for the neighborhood to hear his side of the story. As the neighbors gathered in his living room that evening, Ethan felt a mix of nerves and determination. Some of them, like Jared, had been supportive from the beginning. Others were more hesitant, unsure of where they stood in the ongoing drama. But Ethan didn't care. This was his chance to take control of the situation once and for all. He spoke plainly, without hiding anything. "I want to clear the air," he said, his voice steady but full of conviction. I've been accused of causing problems, of being the source of the tension in this neighborhood. But that's not true. The truth is, Karen has been using her position on the HOA board to manipulate people, to push her own agenda. I've tried to follow the rules, to be a good neighbor, but I won't stand by while she continues to use her power to control us. There was a moment of silence as the room absorbed his words. Ethan could see the skepticism in some faces, but he didn't let it deter him. He knew that the truth had power, and it was time to let that power speak for itself. I'm not here to fight anyone. I'm here to ask for your support, Ethan continued. We've all been living in this neighborhood, trying to do what's best for our homes and our families. But we can't let one person continue to divide us, to make us afraid to speak up. We have to stand together. One by one, the neighbors began to nod, their expressions shifting from doubt to understanding. Jared spoke first, his voice strong. I've seen what's been going on. And you're right, Ethan. Karen's been making it hard for all of us. We don't need that kind of drama in our neighborhood. More voices joined in, offering support, sharing their own frustrations with Karen's tactics. By the end of the evening, Ethan had gained a solid group of allies, people who were ready to stand with him and challenge Karen's influence over the HOA. The shift in the room was palpable. The energy had changed. Ethan had won the first battle, not through legal action, but through truth and unity. And it felt like a victory in a way that no court ruling ever could. As the night drew to a close, Ethan felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The path ahead wasn't easy. He knew that. Karen wouldn't give up easily. But for the first time in a long time, Ethan had hope. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. And that made all the difference. As he said goodnight to his neighbors, Ethan knew that the battle was far from over. But now, it wasn't just his fight. It was a community effort. And together, they would face whatever came next, stronger than before. The truth had triumphed, and Ethan had taken back control. He wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. Ethan felt a renewed sense of determination as he watched his neighbors leave that evening. The support he had received was overwhelming. They had stood with him, not just because they felt sorry for him, but because they saw the truth. The truth that Karen had manipulated the HOA, controlled the narrative, and used fear to divide the neighborhood. But now it was different. Now, they were united in their desire to take their community back. Despite the relief he felt, Ethan knew this battle wasn't over. It wasn't going to be a simple win where everything returned to normal. Karen was not the type to back down easily. She had too much invested in maintaining control, and Ethan knew that. As the days went by, he found himself preparing for the next phase of the fight. He wasn't just going to take on Karen head-to-head. He had to show everyone, including Karen, that the neighborhood had changed. People were no longer afraid. They were done with the games she had been playing. The following week, Karen made her move. She showed up unannounced at Ethan's door, her posture stiff and formal, her eyes sharp with the same cold determination that Ethan had seen before. He wasn't surprised to see her, though he did feel a surge of annoyance rise within him. He had hoped that after everything that had happened, she would stay away, but that was never going to be the case. Karen always found a way to weave herself back into the picture. Ethan, Karen began, her voice steely and cold. I think it's time we talk about what's going on in this neighborhood. Ethan didn't let her formalities bother him. He had heard enough of her manipulations to know what was coming. He wasn't going to sit back and be silenced anymore. He had his boundaries, and they would no longer be crossed. I've had enough of this, Karen, Ethan replied, his voice unwavering. You've used your position on the HOA board to intimidate, to control, and to divide. You've made my life miserable, and you've hurt a lot of other people in the process. I'm not going to let you do that anymore. Not to me, and not to anyone else in this neighborhood. Karen's eyes narrowed. You think you've won, don't you? You think that just because a few people decided to support you, that you've got everything figured out. I know I've got people on my side. More importantly, I've got the truth on my side. You've made life difficult for this neighborhood for far too long, and people are waking up to it. You're not the only one who has power in this neighborhood. Karen, It's time you understood that." Her lips curled into a smile that was more menacing than reassuring. "We'll see about that. I don't know how you think this is going to end, but I can assure you, Ethan, this is far from over." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. But this time, Ethan wasn't worried. He wasn't intimidated by her empty threats anymore. He had taken the first step by speaking out, and that was more than Karen could handle. She was no longer the puppet master pulling everyone's strings. The neighborhood was fighting back, and Ethan was leading the charge. In the days that followed, Ethan continued to work with his neighbors. They had formed a group, something informal but effective, that met regularly to discuss the ongoing situation with the HOA. They worked together to gather evidence, to organize community events, and to support each other as they dealt with the lingering influence of Karen and her supporters. Ethan also began working more closely with his lawyer, preparing to take formal legal action against Karen. He knew that she wasn't going to go down without a fight, but he had something she didn't: unity. The people in his community were ready to stand with him, and that was something Karen couldn't control. It wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a community battle, and the tide was turning in Ethan's favor. As the legal proceedings began, Karen's once powerful influence seemed to fade. The more she tried to manipulate, the more people saw through her tactics. Neighbors who had once been afraid to speak out were now coming forward with their own stories of how Karen had pushed them around. People were beginning to see the cracks in her carefully crafted facade, and the more they learned, the more they stood against her. The moment that really shifted things came when the HOA decided to hold a public meeting. Ethan had been preparing for this meeting for weeks. He knew that Karen would try to rally her supporters, but he also knew that he had the truth and the momentum on his side. The room was packed when the meeting began, with more and more people showing up to voice their opinions. Ethan stood tall as he took his place at the front, ready to make his case. As the meeting unfolded, Karen tried to dominate the conversation, as she always had. But the tide had shifted. People weren't listening to her anymore. They were looking to Ethan, seeing him not as a troublemaker, but as someone who had finally stood up to the injustices she had imposed on the neighborhood. One by one, neighbors spoke out, sharing their own experiences of how Karen had manipulated them or enforced unreasonable rules for her own gain. Karen's face flushed with anger as she realized that the room was no longer hers to command. She tried to interrupt, to lash out, but the more she did, the more people pushed back. Ethan felt a sense of satisfaction, not because Karen was losing her power, but because it was no longer about him fighting alone. The community had come together, and that made all the difference. As the meeting ended, Ethan felt a quiet sense of triumph. He wasn't just fighting for his rights anymore. He was fighting for his entire neighborhood. The influence of the HOA had been broken, and Karen's reign of control was crumbling. She had no more power over them, and the community was stronger for it. For Ethan, this wasn't just about legal victories or winning arguments. It was about reclaiming the peace he had lost. It was about standing up to someone who had used their power to manipulate and destroy, and saying, "No more." And in the end, the true victory wasn't in the courtroom or HOA meetings. It was in the unity of the neighborhood, the strength of the people coming together to fight for what was right. Ethan knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in his life, but he was ready for it. With the support of his neighbors, his family, and the strength of his own conviction, he was confident that no one would ever take away his peace again. The battle was over, and he had emerged victorious, not because of the legal victories, but because he had fought for what truly mattered. And in the end, that was more than enough. In the weeks following the HOA meeting, Ethan experienced a sense of calm he hadn't felt in months. The air in his neighborhood had shifted. It was as if a heavy fog had lifted, revealing a fresh landscape full of possibility. Karen Miller, the once feared HOA board member, had seen her influence crumble. The community, once divided by her manipulative tactics, had come together, stronger and more united than ever before. For the first time in ages, Ethan found himself breathing easier. The weight of constant surveillance, of knowing that Karen was always watching, had disappeared. His days were no longer filled with the anxiety of what would happen next. Even when he walked around his property or interacted with his neighbors, there was a newfound sense of ease. It was as though he could finally enjoy the home he had worked so hard for, without the looming threat of Karen's interference. Still, there was the matter of the lingering effects of the fight. Karen, despite her defeat, wasn't going to fade into the background quietly. Ethan knew her well enough to understand that she wasn't the type to accept defeat. He had already seen how she manipulated situations, how she used her charm and position to control others. But now, something was different. The power had shifted, and Karen, for once, was left without the upper hand. As the dust settled, Ethan and Vanessa spent more time together, enjoying the quiet moments they had been robbed of during the long battle. They took walks around their neighborhood, chatting about their hopes for the future. Their conversations had a lightness to them now, an ease that hadn't been there before. They began to take more pride in their home, focusing on what was truly important: their life together, their peace and their love for each other. Then, one afternoon, as Ethan sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, a familiar figure caught his eye. It was Karen. She was walking down the street, her posture as stiff as ever, her eyes fixed straight ahead. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen her since the meeting, and though he had learned to stand his ground, the sight of her still stirred up a mix of emotions. He had fought for his peace, but that didn't mean he was completely free of her shadow. Karen didn't stop at his house, but the mere sight of her walking down the street triggered something in Ethan. He had come so far to protect his life, and he wasn't about to let her return to her old ways. Even if she had lost her position on the HOA board, he watched her for a moment, feeling a simmering frustration building inside of him. Karen hadn't just caused problems for him. She had tried to destroy everything he had worked for. And now, even in her defeat, she was still walking the same streets as if nothing had changed. That, he realized, was the problem. Ethan didn't feel the old fear he once had when seeing Karen, but there was a lingering feeling of anger, of unresolved tension. He knew that if he didn't act, if he didn't take a stand, Karen might still find a way to undermine the peace he had fought so hard to achieve. He stood up from the porch, determination settling over him like a cloak. He wasn't going to let Karen continue to linger in the background, trying to manipulate the community or make things difficult. It was time for him to take the final step, to not just win the battle, but to truly reclaim his peace and ensure that Karen would never be able to disrupt his life again. The next day, Ethan went to the local community center and organized a neighborhood meeting. He invited anyone who was willing to listen, hoping to get as many people involved as possible. This wasn't just about one person anymore. It was about the neighborhood standing together to ensure that no one, no matter how powerful they thought they were, could impose their will on others. The meeting was a success. Dozens of neighbors showed up, some of them expressing gratitude for Ethan's efforts, others sharing their own stories of Karen's interference and control. It was clear that the entire community had been affected by Karen's reign, and now they were ready to take back their neighborhood. Together, they agreed to form a more transparent, fair group to represent their interests, one that would ensure the HOA could no longer hold power over them. Ethan could feel a sense of unity building within the room. He wasn't alone in this anymore. There were people who had once been hesitant, unsure of where they stood, but now they were coming together with a common goal: to take control of their own lives and ensure that no one could impose their will on them again. After the meeting, Ethan returned home, a feeling of satisfaction settling over him. He wasn't just securing his peace, he was securing the future of the entire neighborhood. Karen had pushed him to his limits, but in the end, she had inadvertently sparked a movement that would forever change the dynamic of the community. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood began to take on a new energy. People were more engaged, more connected to one another. Ethan felt a sense of pride as he watched the transformation unfold. What had once been a divided neighborhood, held together by fear and manipulation, was now a community that supported one another. Even as Karen tried to regain some of her influence, it was clear that she no longer had the power she once did. The collective strength of the neighborhood, the unity that had formed out of their shared experiences, kept her at bay. Karen no longer had a foothold in their lives, and Ethan knew that it was only a matter of time before she finally realized that her days of control were over. Ethan sat on his porch that evening, watching the sunset, a sense of peace enveloping him. He had fought hard for this moment, and now, with the support of his neighbors and the love of his family, he knew that he had won. He wasn't just fighting for his own peace. He was fighting for the peace of everyone around him. And in the end, that made all the difference. The neighborhood was no longer a battleground. It was a home again. And that was the greatest victory of all.